As Sally mentioned, there seems to be many details missing, and something about this story in just the short 10 verses makes me tired. A lot happened in these 10 verses, and it got me thinking about fatigue, compassion fatigue, to be exact, and I looked it up to see what the exact definition was, and I found this answer by Dr. Charles Figley, a professor at Tulane University, who says, compassion fatigue is a state experienced by those helping people or animals in distress. It is an extreme state of tension and preoccupation with the suffering of those being helped, to the degree that it can create secondary traumatic stress for the helper. So, that is to say, caring for others makes us tired. And this is what I imagine Jesus experiencing at the end of the Sabbath day in Capernaum. So last week, if you were here, we heard the story where Jesus is at the synagogue and he casts out the demon and his fame is spreading. Remember that? And so this week, we find Jesus and his friends heading off to Simon's house for dinner. His friend's house. He's going to go have some dinner on the Sabbath. And he finds himself there with the mother-in-law being really sick. And so Jesus does what Jesus does. Healing touch, heals the mother-in-law, who promptly gets up and starts serving food, but that's another sermon. But then a whole huge crowd gathers outside the house. And so Jesus spends the whole night healing people, casting out demons, telling those demons that are still there to be quiet. And it's no wonder that after the day changes to the next day and it's still dark, so the middle of the night, Jesus creeps off for a quiet place. It's really no wonder. Now, most of us do not spend our days casting out demons and touching folks and finding them healed. But what does cause us compassion fatigue? Is it caring for a loved one? Is it worry about our own health or the health of someone else we love? Is it stress about the state of our world? Is it concern for your children? Is it concern for someone who struggles with mental health issues or addiction? Is it concern for someone stuck in a domestic violence situation? Are you in a caring profession where your job is to be in steady contact with those who might be in a difficult place? Any of these things, or then other things that I didn't even think to mention, can get to us. We can all suffer from this compassion fatigue, some of us more than others, some of us sort of with a low-grade constant fatigue, some of us where it peaks and valleys, where we get really bogged down and then we feel a little bit better and then it hits again. And even Jesus was not immune to the exhaustion that comes from caring for other people. Jesus wasn't able to keep going and going and going and going without ceasing. Instead, as the sun went down on that Sabbath day, the day designed intentionally for rest, Jesus disappears. He goes and plays hide and seek, but he doesn't tell anybody he's playing. He has to sneak out, unnoticed, for a moment of peace and quiet, a moment to breathe, to rest, to recover, to connect with God. Jesus did it, but what about us? Because like Jesus, we are not immune to the exhaustion that comes from caring for others. And like Jesus, we aren't able to keep going and going and going and going without stopping. And so like Jesus, we have to find a way to escape and recover. Now, lest you think this is completely revolutionary, our Bible talks about Sabbath rest. I did a Google search and it was like 170 times the word Sabbath is mentioned. So just a few times our Bible mentions the idea of building in rest into our lives. And yet, as our society has shifted and evolved, we have become less and less able to really set aside that time. We filled our Sabbath with more and more and more stuff. We don't really set aside a day as a society where virtually everything around us is closed. I mean, many of us are going to go out to lunch, for instance, and do some shopping. And we don't have a day as a society that's designed intentionally for the whole day to be spent with our faith community and our families of choice. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shift back, because inherently the separation of church and state is really good and it's all fine, but it gives us a bigger challenge. We have to instead find ways to create that Sabbath rest in our lives. Now, Jesus snuck out in the middle of the night. Maybe we carve out a little time by getting up a little bit earlier than we might otherwise. Maybe we carve out a little time by staying up a bit later than we might otherwise. Maybe we skip being distracted at lunchtime and turn the TV off, turn our phones off, and eat quietly. Maybe we make intentional choices about somewhere in our week to set aside a couple of hours and don't let anything else get scheduled there. But Jesus reminds us that if we're not careful, the concerns of our immediate families, of our community, of our world will be gathered outside of our door and will never go away. And so I invite us to think about one tiny change, one little thing. We're not doing revolutionary here. I'm not saying from now on, every single Sunday, from sun up to sundown, you do nothing. One little thing that you can do this coming week. Think about it. One thing. Got it? And it's not much time. But now I want you to turn to the person next to you. And I want you to tell that person what one thing you're going to do. You're going to try it. One little thing. Go ahead. Think of something. I'm going to turn my phone off. That's what I'm going to do. Okay. Okay. All right. You got one thing? Okay, now I want you to turn to that person, make sure you know their name. Because the other part of this puzzle is that Jesus' disciples went out and found him. They checked in on him, how he was doing. So next week, I want you to find your person and ask them, how'd it go? And now this is not guilty. This is not guilt, right? This is accountability, and accountability is different from guilt. This is where we check in and where we can say, I totally did not do that, and it's okay. Or it went great, or it was all right, but it didn't really work, and instead I'm going to try this other thing. But the disciples had a chance to check in on Jesus. And so in putting those pieces that Sally talked about, all those details that the story doesn't really tell us, I imagined that Jesus didn't do this. Jesus didn't go off and hide. And Jesus kept going. And then I imagine the disciples having to have a little intervention and say, Jesus, you're a little bit cranky. You're kind of exhausted here. You're useless to everybody around you. You better go away for a while. Can you imagine that, right? That's what happens to us. And so by having that crowd of people and Jesus' closest friends who say, I'm going to find you, they were held accountable. And we too need to have others help us. Help us in this faith thing that we do. Help us in this resting so that we can keep doing the work that God has called us to do. So this week, I invite us to be a little bit like Jesus and to find our metaphorical deserted place and go and rest and pray and breathe. And I invite us to be like Simon and check in on one another next week. See how it went. And so as we look forward to what comes, I invite our attention to the table that is set before us. This table where all are welcome, each and every one of us, to this feast, where you're invited to come and sit a spell. Come, let us prepare ourselves for the feast before us.